Hello and welcome back to another old tech related video. Recently, I went to pick up a lot of old Apple stuff on behalf of Hugh Jeffries. He didn't have much interest in another Mac Pro, so now it's mine to play around with. The previous owner bought this from America as a B-grade Mac Pro for $2,300 back in 2013, with the postage costing around $362. I don't think this is the original box as the specifications are crossed out, so this will be a bit of a surprise to see what model it actually is, and if it actually works. Opening up the box, there are a few Apple keyboards, a mouse, and trackpad. I'll probably send most of those off to Hugh as I don't really need them. And underneath the foam, there's a very hefty Mac Pro. A little bit too heavy to lift straight up like this, but with the box on its side, it came out a lot easier. So here is the free Mac Pro. It doesn't appear to have any dents or obvious signs of issues. I'm pretty sure there's supposed to be the specifications listed right here, but for some reason they've been removed. And this doesn't appear to be the original graphics card. Hopefully it's going to be good enough for us to play some games. But looking a bit closer, there's definitely some rust forming on it. So we'll have to open up this old Mac to get an idea of what exactly it is. This Mac was meant to be user upgradable, which means it is very easy to upgrade and get into. And it looks like all 4 RAM slots are occupied by 8GB sticks totaling 32GB. In fact, the processor along with the RAM are part of this removable card, meaning this is one of the later Mac Pro models. After turning it on, it does play the boot chime, but nothing seems to show up on the screen. And taking a closer look, the graphics card has a considerable amount of rust on parts of it. So we'll go ahead and remove the card. But what to replace it with? Well, the previous owner also had this, what I think is an eSATA card and another GPU entirely. This is the 3GB Radeon 7950 released in 2013, which is apparently around 250% faster than the 4870 I'm replacing. But was the rust causing the old card not to work? Well, let's take off the also satisfying peelies and find out. I'm not sure why they weren't simply using this card instead of the old one. I don't think they knew what the problem was. Once again, with it all plugged in, I patiently waited, and it finally displayed video. But no version of macOS was found though. There was some kind of PCI SSD in the Mac, but the installer simply didn't detect it at all. It looks like it has 2 60GB SATA SSDs on it, and also its fair share of rust. Not exactly what you want to see, but it turns out that the card I thought was just for eSATA is actually a PCI SSD. I put it in and it turns out it's 240GB, and macOS installed without issue. So I think this is actually an early 2009 model flashed with the 2010 5-1 Mac Pro firmware. But if we want to play games, Windows is our best option. But it turns out you can't install it to one of the PCI SSDs. So I had to install a SATA one. You also have to install Windows with an optical disk, but the internal drive wouldn't read the disk, so I tried using an external one. Finally, I was able to use Boot Camp to load into the Windows 7 installer, but it sadly failed while copying over the files. And since the first DVD was a bit scratched up, I burnt a new one. I once again began the installation, only to have it fail with the new DVD I burnt as well. Maybe it can't be installed properly from an external DVD drive, so let's try to solve the internal one's problem. It is quite dusty and maybe there's dust on the laser. It is also pretty cool that there's extra screws for a second drive here if you need them. And with the drive removed from the caddy, I gave it a quick wipe down. The internal laser was absolutely spotless, so I don't think this was causing any issue. The mechanism that moves the laser was a bit stiff, so I applied a small amount of Teflon dry lubricant. And while I had the caddy out, I gave it a wipe off with a small amount of eucalyptus oil. I'll be giving it a proper clean out when I do a complete disassembly later on. And after several attempts, the internal DVD drive read the Windows installer disk. I think it simply doesn't like reading burnt DVDs. Anyway, I went through the Boot Camp setup, and this time we had some more success, and it was finally transferring the files. And after updating Windows 7 to the latest, most secure patches, I can finally test out some games. First of all, I tried playing some Minecraft. I was on my server and was getting a very decent frame rate. Sadly, someone DDoSed the server a few days after this, and it is currently down for the foreseeable future, but I do hope to get it up and running once again. On the bright side, a much more demanding game called PUBG was totally playable. At a resolution of 1080p and the graphics on low settings, it was constantly getting between 60 and 70 frames per second. Quite impressive on such an old Mac. BeamNG Drive is another game that can be quite taxing on older systems. On normal graphics settings at a resolution of 1080p, it was comfortably getting between 48 and 60 frames per second. And if you were to put the settings to low, it managed to get over 80 frames per second. Another game I tested was CSGO, maintaining over 140 frames per second on medium settings, very playable on this system. And in the graphical benchmark Unigine Heaven, it scored a respectable 500 points clear of it running the same benchmark in macOS using OpenGL. And the scores in the CPU benchmark Cinebench were identical in both Windows and macOS. The CPU also didn't exceed 81 degrees Celsius after many runs. We'll see how it performs after changing the thermal paste. Now it's time to take it apart and see what's inside. First, I began by giving the case a wipe down with some eucalyptus oil. It's clearly been looked after and isn't too dirty, which is nice to see. Nearly every part of this Mac Pro is removable, and the cheap SSD I put in here for Windows should be fine. It's nearly hitting the theoretical maximum speed for a SATA 2 connection. The fact that there are so many drive bays is great, but again, sadly only SATA 2, not the much faster SATA 3 interface. It really wouldn't be worth doing a CPU upgrade as it's already running one of the best 6-core processors that'll fit in this socket. The fact that this machine is still very usable after 11 years is quite impressive, and this is largely due to the machine being upgradable, something that nearly every modern Mac is not. This didn't originally have USB 3, so I simply put in a USB 3 PCI card. Unlike the iMacs of the time, the Mac Pro had adequate cooling with many fans. This also does mean that it could sound like a jet engine under heavy loads though. But this is the model with a single CPU socket, meaning it shouldn't get as hot. The power supply is sadly proprietary, but also easy to remove. And at a maximum of 980 watts, this should have enough headroom for whatever drives or processors you want to put in. Now here comes the fun part, sucking up all the dust. These Mac Pros can get quite dusty inside, mainly due to the large volumes of air they intake through the whole system. Unlike some of the last Power Mac G5s, this is air-cooled, thankfully not liquid-cooled. The Quad G5 machines ran very hot, hence the need for liquid cooling, which would often leak. I dusted around the processor, which did have some kind of residue on the surface of the board. It could be from one of the capacitors, but they all do look intact, and with a wipe with some isopropyl alcohol, it cleaned up really well. The old thermal paste was definitely quite crusty, but I have a feeling the CPU was changed when the previous owner bought it back in 2013. The processor that's in here is a Xeon W3680, which can be bought online for about 50 bucks. A decent upgrade if your Mac Pro is 2009 or newer and only has a single quad-core CPU. And with the die cleaned off with iso alcohol, I could apply some new thermal paste. I spread it out evenly over the surface. I can see why it's pretty common to gut these cases and put modern components in. The cheese grater design still looks really nice. It's simple, clean, and after all these years, I still want to use one. While Apple still sells a Mac Pro, it's ludicrously expensive, and I don't think it's been updated since mid-2019, making this old Mac still desirable and still a truly good deal if you can get one cheap enough. If you're going to buy one, check it thoroughly, and luckily this one only had rust on the PCI cards and this small bracket. And after sanding it back and treating it with rust converter, it shouldn't rust any further. And now it's all back together, nice and clean once again. Can you game on an old Mac Pro? Well, yes. In fact, if you're willing to spend heaps of money, you could put in an RX 580 GPU, but those are ridiculously overpriced right now. My girlfriend also had lots of fun learning to play PUBG on here. And redoing the thermal paste yielded core temperatures about 15 degrees cooler, a good improvement. Not bad for a machine that was being given away. And I'll be sure to find a use for this old machine, which still has lots of life left in it. So there we have it, another old machine cleaned up and looking a whole lot better. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you've liked it, feel free to leave a like, and if you want to see more, definitely consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next video.